thank you for having me. It's a real honor that the Chancellor has come as well. These photos here, and I'm going to try and talk without the mic. If people are having difficulty hearing me, let me know, and then I'll switch over to the mic. But the first, this picture and this picture are for a wind turbine, a 2 megawatt wind turbine that we're using to power our coastal campus in Lewis, Delaware. That was commissioned in June of 2011, and this is the foundation, and this is what's referred to as the nacelle. It's got the guts of the wind turbine, and this is a photo from when I was at and took a tour of the Newstead wind farm in Denmark off the coast. If you ever get a chance to tour a wind farm, I would say go ahead and do it. I thought it was like Disneyland for adults. It was quite otherworldly, seeing a wind turbine in the water. So first, I'm just going to give a little background about wind energy and offshore wind energy, and then I'm going to talk about our research on social acceptance and public perception. So where are we today? Basically, only in Europe. There's a lot that's happened in Europe. You can see it's almost all in the North Sea. And indeed, right now, Europe is just below 3,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So quite impressive. The UK, for many years, Denmark was the leader in the world, and at present, the UK is, and they have a very aggressive program for offshore wind. France just announced this week its intentions to move towards offshore wind. And you can see, I mean, Denmark gets a large fraction of its electricity from wind energy, including offshore wind, and on occasion, it generates more electricity than it needs, and then is able to push that on to the European grid when it generates more than it needs for its own citizens. These are big machines. Make no doubt about it. You can see this is a person down on the floor, and this again is the nacelle where you've got the generator, and it houses the rotor. And you can see these machines offshore are so big that they're basically built in ports. And when you can build bigger machines offshore, because you then take them out on a ship and out to sea, these machines are too big to go on roads or rail. The blades are too long. So this is a sort of smaller machine, if you will. This is more typical now of a land-based machine. The one on our campus is just over 400 feet. But the bigger machines that they're starting to build offshore are closer to about 475 and are going to probably move towards the mid-500s as they get bigger. Offshore, we're sort of set up in an array. The wind turbines, they're spaced about 10 rotor diameters apart in the main direction of the wind, and 5 rotor diameters on crosswinds. So you basically have about a half a mile between them. It doesn't need to be an exclusion zone. Obviously, you want to exclude people from coming right up to the wind turbine. A lot of that is in part for liability reasons, but people can boat through these and do what have you. There are a number of threats that we're seeing in the U.S. To moving forward with this. We've got a very lengthy permit process. Things have moved very slow. In the U.S., Congress passed legislation to set up a regulatory regime in 2005. It took the government 4 years to promulgate regulations, and they haven't done a very quick job of implementing them. The Secretary recently made an announcement that to try and reinvigorate the program, and to it was set up so that there was going to be multiple environmental reviews, and to try and consolidate that all down to one environmental review, because the federal NEPA process, the environmental impact statement, it takes 2 to 3 years to do one, and obviously if you can cut that down to 1 from 2, you can lop off 2 to 3 years right there. There's some, marine spatial planning. There's concern that might delay things as we move towards marine spatial planning, but I think that's probably more of a fear than something that legitimately is going to happen. The planning on offshore wind is going forward. Certainly, we've got some concern about long-term financing. These are very capitally intensive projects. It costs about $1 billion to build one. The advantage is, you know, like the seawater air conditioning, once you build the infrastructure, you do have O&M costs as far as maintenance, but you don't pay for a fuel. And so whenever you have a capital intensive project, it's not, in this way it shares a lot with nuclear power. You spend a lot up front, and if you can figure out ways through financing to lower the cost of borrowing, you can really decrease significantly the amount per kilowatt hour that consumers are ultimately going to have to pay on their rates. So financing is really key. And we've seen that social acceptance is important as well. And social acceptance involves decision makers and regulators on one hand, and public acceptance on the other. I'm mostly going to talk about public acceptance today. In some of our discussions over lunch, we focused in on the decision makers and regulators, and if I have time, we'll discuss some of what happened in Delaware related to how we went about and ultimately were successful in gaining a long-term contract to buy energy from offshore wind power, the first one in the Americas. And interest. This is sort of tells you the story. You know, we do have some people saying, "God, I don't want to look at a wind farm." It's interesting. In Delaware, we've got a coal plant that's only about 9 miles inland, and so that's why this comment came as we were debating offshore wind in Delaware. And people, we found through our tourism study, are actually somewhat oblivious to the fact that they're 9 miles away from a coal plant. The residents know it, and that's in part a lot of the story of us being able to be successful with offshore wind, but the tourists don't seem to really realize that they're downwind of a coal plant. So we've done a whole series of work to understand what the public thinks, and we got motivated both because of concerns over public health and climate change, and we found this interesting situation off of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where people both claimed to be environmentalists. Some were opposed to the project and some were in favor of the project, and that we don't usually get that kind of dynamic in public debate. And as social scientists, we were interested in looking at this. My colleague, Willett Kempton, has a background in anthropology, and so he sort of led the effort in our semi-structured interviews. And semi-structured interviews are really important to understanding what people think or using other qualitative approaches. And we ultimately use those qualitative approaches to get some feeling behind what people tell us through surveys, plus it helps us devise survey instruments and make sure we're asking the right questions, rather than putting a survey out front without having some inkling as to what people might misperceive and what might motivate them. So we did a series of interviews of 8 proponents, 8 opponents, and then 8 people who we just randomly selected. And we just sort of did this as professors and got our students engaged. We didn't have any grants. And then we went out and started doing surveys. And we did our first survey on the cheap. I got a very small grant from my university. This shows you, where universities can be really catalytic in helping young professors start off research programs. I got a $6,000 grant. And we had to be really cheap on the survey. Mail surveys, the largest expense is postage. And so we had to be very careful that we didn't go over just the amount that would require us to put another stamp on, either to mail it or to take it back. So it was a real test. So we did that survey of Cape Cod. Then, before anything was really on the radar in Delaware, we got a grant from our Green Energy Fund. We pay a very small fee that goes towards Green Energy Fund. In our state, it's mostly used to help people buy solar, but they also gave us a research grant to do a similar study in Delaware. Plus, we did some work on regulatory programs. And subsequently, we did a study of out-of-state tourists that I briefly talked about. One of my students has done a national survey that looked at sort of views of, one, how people value the ocean, but then there were a number of questions about offshore wind and about offshore oil and gas, and so we've got some comparative work there. And then I'm mostly going to talk about this survey that we did in 2009, and working on my plane right here, I worked on the paper that we're writing up our results. So case studies, again, are Cape Cod. So you can see Cape Cod is an unusual, here's Cape Cod. It's surrounded by Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket Island. Yeah, so here's a blow up of it. And what's unusual about this area is that state waters, state-controlled waters, go out 3 nautical miles, but this is further than 3 nautical miles from any coast. It's in federal waters, so it's a federal donut hole of federal jurisdictional waters, and so the federal government is the main permitter for this project. It's about 6 miles to Hyannis, about 9 miles to Martha's Vineyard, and about 13 to 14 to Nantucket Island. And then we have after we did our first Delaware survey, we learned, we got this bid, and eventually we have a project that's now 13 miles off of Delaware. You can see both share a similar, are similar in that they're both nearby. Both wind farms would be near old, antiquated fossil fuel power plants. And interestingly, that seems to have played a large role in Delaware, but a much less of a role in Cape Cod. People don't really seem to grasp onto the fact in Cape Cod that they're presently using an old, antiquated fossil fuel plant. So again, we've got a major, all of our coast is heavily used by tourism, but the largest area here would be Rehoboth Beach. And we've got boardwalks on Rehoboth Beach. So this is a major tourist area, and so it shares that with Cape Cod. Sampling and how you do your sampling is real important. So we look at census data, and what we wanted to do is get not just large swaths, but some specialized swaths of people. And so we have this area in Delaware, which are people who live very near the coast on average. We want to get people who have ocean views. And we did the same thing in Cape Cod. So we created this area called the Sound, which is people who are in a census tract that border Nantucket Sound. So we could get, again, views of people who might have a view. We spend a lot of time on our mail surveys. It's really important both to get them unbiased and to get your questions right. You've only got so much time and so much attention. We generally go through 15 to 20 iterations on a survey. We then take it out to usually